So we're going to be talking about the bare basics of how I would go about choosing a piece of video gaming hardware. And full disclosure, this topic is actually inspired from a conversation between myself and a former coworker of mine. She was talking with me about, like, Brandon, I think I want to try getting into gaming, but, I've never really done it before, so I want to get an idea of, like, what you would recommend. And we talked about it, but, it occurred to me, since we had a limited time and a limited forum, considering, shifts end at a certain point in the night, during the day, whenever you're working, that I was like, man, this might make a great podcast topic, regardless of whether this individual sees it or not. It was inspired by this person, and I was thinking about it, I was like, man, I guess that would be a good topic just to, in general, tell folks my recommendations if they want to get into gaming. And I also want to clarify going into here that I am making this segment assuming that you, as the listener, know absolutely nothing about gaming whatsoever. If you're listening to this, you probably do know a significant amount about video games. But one tactic that I was taught to use in doing presentations and videos and the like in school was, you want to assume your audience knows nothing. Because if you assume they know something and you don't define something that's important, you could end up confusing them way down the way. So a lot of this information, if you're like a gamer, even if you're like a little more casual like me, or if you're an especially hardcore gamer, this is certainly going to seem like a retread. And I want to apologize out of the gate if it seems like I'm coming off as like I'm talking down at all, because it's not what I'm going for. But there are genuinely some folks who, if I were to ask them what a controller is, that they would probably not know what it is. So I want to teach as much as possible. And I'm not going to define what a controller is, because that was just something I pulled out of thin air. So first, I guess I want to I want to lay out the options, or at least I have like a few categories that I want to talk about for systems. There are niche systems, they're streaming, not quite systems, they're streaming services, there are retro systems, there's the last generation of systems, and the next generation of systems. I guess just to make it a little more clear then, I'm really only talking about consoles and handhelds to an extent here, because PC gaming is really its own separate thing, and I feel like giving any discussion on PC gaming would only really be useful if I were doing an advanced type of discussion on how to choose hardware. Because like I said, I'm intending this for folks who really don't know anything about games and electronics. So if you don't know anything about gaming or electronics, trying to do PC gaming, I feel like would be a nightmare. Even me, someone who's pretty casual, I feel like it would be a little bit of a nightmare. And I'm going to define these 5 categories: niche, streaming, retro, last gen, and next gen, along the way as they're relevant. But there are 3 terms that I was thinking about when I was writing this that I want to define right now that I'm going to use throughout. And those are exclusive games, first-party games, and third-party games. When I'm talking about an exclusive, or an exclusive game, I'll probably just say an exclusive. I'm talking about any game that is only available on one platform. And those could be first-party games or third-party games. So an example that I thought about of a game that I really want to play that ended up being an exclusive was Klonoa 2, Lunatea's Veil. It's a game that is exclusive to the PlayStation 2. You can only play it on the PS2. It wasn't necessarily planned to be exclusive, but it only ended up being on the PS2 in the end. When I talk about a first-party game, I am referring to a game that is developed or published by the same company that makes the hardware. So literally any Nintendo game. So if I talk about Mario, if I talk about Zelda, if I talk about Smash Brothers, Kirby, whatever else, those are all games that are only available on Nintendo platforms because they are published by Nintendo. Just for comparison, and just so I have a non-Nintendo example too, Halo is a famous first-party franchise on Xbox only. Of course, now Microsoft's making that a little more complicated since they're trying to get some of their games on Windows. Of course, Microsoft also makes Windows, so it works out. It's still in a first-party space since it's not on Mac or Linux. But I'm getting a little off track here. Generally speaking, though, if I'm talking about a first-party game, it should be exclusive. Whereas a third-party game refers to a game made by literally anyone else. And even these come with their own separate denominations. They're AAA games, which are games that are developed and published by large studios. So that could be Capcom, that could be Activision, that could be Ubisoft, that could be Namco Bandai. Klonoa 2 is an example of a third-party AAA game, but that just also happens to be a PS2 exclusive. The other type are indie games, which, they're just like indie musicians in the sense that this is an independent game studio. So as far as other third-party games, most third-party games end up on multiple platforms. Probably the poster boy of a AAA third-party game that ends up being on multiple platforms is the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. Man, it really helps to be able to speak when you're doing a podcast. And that's on just about any machine known to man, because Bethesda, well, they were a third-party developer, now they're working with Microsoft, but that's beside the point. And like I said, an indie game can come out on just about anything. There are very, very few instances where an indie game is exclusive for any reason other than the developer just isn't interested in porting the game. So one of my favorite indie games is Freedom Planet, and that's on PC, that's on Mac, it's on Linux, it's on PS4, it's on Wii U, and it's on Switch. It's a third-party game, but generally if you're talking about an independent game, you're going to just call it an indie game. So I hope that defines enough terms here. If there's anything that I am missing, I guarantee you that there will be an updated version of this topic in a later podcast because, the more feedback I get in understanding, where might I be missing, or what biases do I have as someone who's even, a casual, hardcore gamer. What am I not addressing? What information am I addressing that might be useful that I'm just not including at the moment? With that all said, I want to go over our categories of systems. So first I want to talk about your niche options. And the two that came to mind here were the Atari VCS and the Intellivision Amico. And these are not systems that anyone's going to do any serious gaming on. And by that I don't mean that you can't do hardcore gaming. It's just that their game selection is so limited that these two systems are not really the ones that most people are looking for. Generally speaking, I cannot think of any scenario where I could recommend these two particular consoles to someone who just wants to start getting into gaming, because they're really meant for a specific audience, and these are audiences that probably know a lot about games, or they're very, very nostalgic for a specific purpose. The people who wanted an Atari VCS already have the Atari VCS, is the idea. And it's kind of like a strange little PC rather than a console. Anyway, the Amico isn't even out, and I really, really highly recommend the completely unnecessary podcast coverage of the Intellivision Amico. I'm sure there's a playlist out there somewhere about it, because, man, there are so many laughable aspects about that console as far as just, it was supposed to come out in 2019 a couple of times, and it's still 2021, and they keep pushing back the release date. And the games, they're supposed to be all exclusive games or have Amico exclusive features. But in practice, we're either not seeing that come about, or if a game is exclusive, it's kind of like a laughably exclusive game, like the Intellivision remakes, because, the games that I want to play in 2021 are games that are nearly 50 years old, and basically arcade games. Nothing wrong with arcade games, but they're particular arcade games that have continued to succeed for a reason. Just in general, the game selection on those is pretty laughable, and it shares a problem with the next category I'm going to lay out, which is the Amico doesn't understand that it should be niche. Or I guess really I should say the Amico doesn't understand that it should be niche, and that is a problem it shares with one of the next options in the category I'll lay out next. So, the audience for these types of games is small. It's not non-existent, but in the case of the Amico, it's basically limited to folks who grew up with the Intellivision. So if someone came up to me and they wanted to know what piece of hardware I would recommend to them, even understanding some of their questions about asking them some questions and getting more specifics, I cannot think of a scenario where I would recommend either of these two. Your next options are streaming options. So I think everyone knows what a streaming service is. Like they've used Netflix or they've used Hulu or Spotify or whatever. It is a platform where you are letting a company's servers do the computing work for you. At least in the case of games, you're having the company's servers do their computer work for you. So the streaming services that are out there for gaming are Google Stadia and Amazon Luna. So essentially what you do for these is you're going to pay a subscription to be like, I'm going to use Google Stadia. At least if you want to get a better experience on Stadia. There is a free version, but you get very limited visual fidelity, and frame rates aren't as great on the free version. Luna is technically still not out, so I'm really not going to address that one so much, but it is an option. I just want to make people aware that it's out there. But essentially you've paid money to Google or Amazon, but you have to go ahead and still purchase the full game to stream it to your device. And that device could be your smart TV, it could be your computer, it could be your smartphone. And I already did a segment on Stadia a few episodes ago and the problems that it faces. I'd prefer really that folks check that out to get an understanding of Stadia's problems even better, but I just want to give a brief rundown in case you don't want to go ahead and listen to that at the moment. Stadia has quite a few issues, but the big ones are the games are mostly old. There are not a lot of new, truly new games on Stadia. Like I said, you have to pay a subscription, and then you still have to pay full price to get a game that you're not necessarily going to own. So just for comparison, when you get a Netflix subscription, you get access to all those movies. You don't own the movie, sure, but you only had to pay once to subscribe to the service. And probably the most important, one of the most important flaws, Google is infamous for killing many of its services, and Stadia could just as easily fall into that, because it has not taken off in the same way that other Google services like Gmail has, for example. And of course, since Stadia and Luna are streaming services, they share this final problem, which is that you need to have a strong and consistent internet connection, and most importantly with a high data cap to really be able to use these, because if you have a pretty bad internet connection, you're not just looking at a game that should be 4K looking like it's 720p, you're also looking at a game that should be running at 60 frames per second running like a slideshow. And if you're not into gaming, you might not realize why that's important, but essentially you're choosing between, if you don't have a good enough internet connection, your game might go like a doot 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 like a slideshow, but the type of game you're playing, you need it to be very smooth. Like a fighting game is a game that you want to have playing at least 60 frames per second. And the reason you need to have a high data cap, which if you don't know what that is, even if you have an unlimited internet plan, you really still in practice have a limited amount of internet you can use in a month from your internet service provider. And streaming games, since games are so big, requires a lot of data. So you need to have a very, very high cap. Otherwise, maybe if you've done a lot of playing on Luna, now when you need to go send or watch some YouTube videos, or if you want to send some emails or do whatever else, go on some Zoom calls because the world is still sick, You can't do it because you don't have any more data to use for your internet. Of course, for Stadia in particular, it hasn't exactly gotten much better because they have barely mentioned it in their Google hardware presentations. Like, I think in the last one they might have mentioned, like, hey, in our new Chromecast, it'll include Stadia, but then when the devices came out, Stadia just wasn't built into it right away. Of course, now the big controversy surrounding Google Stadia is that Google has closed their internal game development studios, so that's not a good sign for it either. And, kind of like I was talking about with the Amico, what Google doesn't understand is that Stadia has a very niche audience that just can't compete with a box under the TV. Because, like I said, you have to have a great internet connection, and you have to be willing to put up with buying games and having a subscription. And, just on top of that, you have to be willing to only get really old-ish games at this point, rather than getting newer experiences. And that's not even getting into the lack of exclusives. It's funny, on the Completely Unnecessary podcast, not to bring it up again, they were talking about Stadia and their closing down of internal studios, and Ian on the podcast was saying, this could work just fine if Stadia played to its strength of being a streaming service by having small, mostly probably independent games, those indie games that don't require a ton of resources necessarily compared to big AAA games, right? And again, I guess I really can't critique Luna so much because it's just not out. So I really don't want to give a judgment of its services without A, having used it, like how I haven't used Stadia, and B, without seeing the official, this is how Amazon Luna is going to be. But like I can't imagine that it's going to get away from the same poor choices that Google has made with Stadia of being a streaming service that sends gigabytes and gigabytes of data to a computer, which requires great internet connection. And I just think about how expensive, actually. That's something that I didn't think about either. These are very expensive services over time because not only do you have to pay the subscription fee, not only do you have to pay for the games at full price, again, that you don't necessarily own, you really also have to factor your internet cost into how much Stadia costs. Those are three major pieces of the puzzle. So that covers two of our categories. The next one I want to talk about is retro gaming. So when I talk about retro gaming, there's really no great definition out there for what does it mean to be a retro gamer. The way I'm thinking about it in this case is you are retro gaming if you are going to play on a system that is at least 2 console generations old. And when I say console generation, I'm talking about a set of hardware that's out for a certain amount of time. So folks will hopefully remember the Wii, PlayStation 3, and Xbox 360, and you can include the Nintendo DS and the PlayStation Portable in there as the handheld offerings during the time. That set of years where those systems were out and were basically the only new hardware, that was the 7th generation of consoles. It got succeeded by the 8th generation. That was when the Nintendo 3DS came out, the Wii U, the PlayStation 4, and Xbox One came out. That was the 8th generation. I hope that makes it kind of clear. I know it's not super clear. But essentially what I'm saying is now that we're in the 9th generation of consoles with the PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X and S, and the Nintendo Switch, that 7th generation and older, that is what I would call a retro game at this point. Plus, they're all mostly 10 years or older now. And there's a good few benefits of playing retro games. There's a low cost of entry, depending on the generation of games you're talking about, and just the price of the game itself. So, like right now, Nintendo GameCube games are super expensive, not to mention the console. I guess I don't know the price of the console off the top of my head, but it's seeing a resurgence in popularity because folks who grew up with the GameCube and the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox are getting to that age. Like they're a little bit older than me, where now they're starting to get a disposable income, so they're wanting to go back and get some of those games they may have had as a child. So certain segments of it are going to be expensive. There was a time when that was true for NES games and SNES games and Sega Genesis games. That's not so much true anymore. Now those games are pretty cheap again. I mean, they're not like dirt cheap depending on the game, but they're not like expensive either. You can get a copy of, I don't know, will be a shovelware type game that you might have just happened to grow up with. Maybe you can get a copy of Wheel of Fortune on the Wii for less than $10. And if you grew up with the Wii, that's great. Now you have a little nostalgia boost there too. But a game like what's another great Wii game? Like I talked about Skyward Sword earlier in this podcast. That game isn't like super duper duper expensive. It's not cheap either. But if you want to get it, it's out there for a reasonable enough price. Another great benefit that I think people really don't talk much about with retro gaming is that there's no new games coming out, not including like homebrew and like hacks, but that's a whole separate like advanced topic for another time. So like if you want to look through the whole library of games on, I don't know, the Sega Saturn, you can look up, here's all of the Sega Saturn games, and you can find which ones are interesting to you so you know what you want to find. And you can have a general idea of how much a collection for you, of what you want to play, is going to cost. Another thing about retro gaming that's useful, or that is like a great benefit to me, is that they're retro games are just a different type of game from modern games. They might be arcadey games. They might just be short games. I talked about, in the last episode, I talked about Dragon Quest 1, how for being a JRPG, it's like an 8-hour game compared to the 100-hour grind fests that RPGs can be today. That could have been bad. A lot of retro games are just iconic. I mean, Super Mario Brothers is arguably the poster child for retro gaming. If it's not Super Mario Brothers, it's probably Pac-Man. So those are like iconic games that you're going to know you're going to want to get. And I think probably the biggest boon to even going for any retro games, not just for the sake of nostalgia, is they don't have some of the bad trappings of modern games. If you want to go out and purchase a copy of Comics Zone on the Sega Genesis, you're getting the full version of Comic Zone. There's no required updates. There's no microtransactions to like hamper your progress, like to intentionally hamper your progress in the game to get you to spend money. Those are like two major things that are happening in modern gaming that retro gaming just doesn't have. The next set I would talk about are the last generation of consoles. So when I'm talking about the last generation, I think I outlined this already. This would be the PlayStation 4, the Xbox One, and the Wii U. Technically, Switch fell in between the 8th and 9th generations, but if I'm going to be honest, I consider it 9th generation hardware just to keep things clean as far as like the separation between these generations is concerned. And really the biggest benefit of going for the PS4 and the Xbox One is these games are at their cheapest. Because folks who already have the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One are trying to get rid of that console and get rid of their games because they want to have money to get the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X. So if you, as someone who's just getting into gaming, could come into this and say, well, maybe I don't really need to play all the newest games at the moment, so I'll just pick up a cheap PS4 that someone's trying to get rid of and pick up a really great game for it when it's at its cheapest. And even then, that doesn't mean there aren't new games coming out for these systems. There are still new third-party games coming out for the PS4 and the Xbox One right now, despite the fact that the Xbox Series X and the PlayStation 5 are out. I mean, granted, that's partially because they just came out, so I can't really give an idea of how many more years there's still going to be new PlayStation 4 and Xbox One games that aren't like legacy sports games and the like, but and even then, they're not going to be the best versions of games necessarily, because you'll see something like maybe the newest Call of Duty is going to be cross-generation between the PS4 and the PS5, and I think I've said them enough, the Xbox One and Xbox Series X. And those last generation versions are definitely going to perform and look worse, but you're still theoretically getting the same game. Okay? So you'll still get some new games on this old hardware as well. Just not the best version. And even then, something that I don't think we talk about enough is that online communities for these games are still active. Mario Kart 8 on Wii U, it certainly has fewer active players than on Switch, but you can still pretty easily get into a room on the Wii U version and be just fine and still play like a sufficient online lobby of Mario Kart 8. So online communities for older games are still active, and so you can still get that online experience too if you want. And even then, probably the greatest thing, and this kind of gets into the next category too, is that if you do decide to upgrade later on to the next generation of consoles, the PS5 and the Series X, not only will those old games on PS4 and Xbox One be backwards compatible with those systems, there's a new initiative to give you, for free of charge, a directly upgraded new version of that game for the system. So one of the things that Microsoft is doing for the Xbox Series X and S is a service called Smart Delivery. And that is a service that essentially, like, the idea is supposed to be if you buy a copy of, like, one of the first games to do this was Crash Bandicoot 4, It's About Time. If you bought Crash Bandicoot 4 on Xbox One, you pop that same disc into Xbox Series X, and lo and behold, now you have a brand new, upgraded 4K. I'm trying to remember. I don't remember if they're going for above 60 frames per second, if they're just still targeting 60 frames on it. But either way, it looks better, and you didn't have to buy another copy for the Xbox Series X. That's the idea, and I think that is brilliant. So even if you want to just cheap out right now and get some last generation games, there's still a chance that if you go ahead and get the next generation later on, you'll be able to play that same game even better. And finally, that brings us to the next generation of consoles, or now I guess they're technically the current generation of consoles. Of course, the main drawback of it is right now they are expensive. But other than that, you get a good few benefits. You're going to be receiving the most cutting-edge experience that a console can get if you're not playing on Switch. If you're playing on Switch, you get the separate benefit of getting a portable version of a game. So, but it's going to look the worst by far. Crash Bandicoot 4, like I just said, on Switch is going to look horrible compared to the PlayStation 5 version, and that's just kind of what it is. Your trade-off is you're playing it portably. The way I wrote this as far as next gen / current gen is, it's almost like you have a constant Christmas, because the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X just came out in November of 2020, and that means it's the start of the 9th generation. At this point, there's still at least 5 to 8 more years of new games coming out for both of those consoles, and probably about 4 to 5 more years for the Nintendo Switch as well. So you'll have access to many new games to be hyped and excited for. And really, I think one of the most interesting things is you also get first access to a ton of gaming innovations as well. And that could be, in the case of the PlayStation 5, the use of solid-state drives to basically eliminate load times. You can start using virtual reality with consoles now, at least now that it's being taken a lot more seriously by developers rather than being like a gaming niche. And of course, you get 4K visuals with potentially frame rates that are above 60 frames per second. So you'll get a really, really smooth and pretty game playing experience. Or, of course, like I said, with Switch, too, you get the benefit that you have portable, full-sized console games coming out to play as well. So, last thing I want to talk about with this is, as far as what I would actually recommend to a beginner for what system or what category type of system I would recommend to them, it's going to come down to questions that I ask them. So if they say, well, I really just want to play these specific games. Well, if you want to play Zelda, you have to have a Nintendo console. If you just want to play third-party games, yeah, you might be able to get by just fine on an Xbox or a PlayStation. Okay, well, I really don't care about how great games look. Okay, well then maybe If you want to go for something a little different, you'll go the retro console. Because then you can play completely different experiences. And even then, you don't have to get the original hardware. You could go for an aftermarket, like Hyperkin sort of deal as well. Well, but I still want to play new games too, to an extent. Well, then that'll be a great reason to pick up the last generation. See, all of those little questions are going to determine what actually gets recommended to you. But I think the point of this segment here was to give like a general breakdown of what each like category of hardware is. So again, expect an updated version of this at some point in the future with more information, better, clear definitions, hopefully. I'm hoping this has been useful to some folks out there, but I really want to see feedback on it for sure. And now I need to take a very brief drink break because, man, my voice is hurting. Ugh. Okay. That's better.